Imagine this: an old man, walking home from the store, completely unaware of the danger closing in around him. Two thugs, driven by greed, approach, eyes set on easy prey. What happens next? You won't believe it. They think they've found an easy target, but they didn't know one thing: the old man has a secret. His son, a highly trained special forces officer, is always ready to protect his family. The tension builds as the thugs make their move, their confidence growing with every step they take. But as the attack unfolds, the old man's calm demeanor hides something much more dangerous. Will the thugs get away with their crime, or will they soon regret crossing the wrong man? Stick around to find out how this shocking confrontation unfolds and how the true strength of family is revealed in the most unexpected way. The two thugs closed in on the old man, their footsteps growing louder on the quiet street. He seemed oblivious, lost in his own world, shuffling along with a slow, steady gait. He wasn't a particularly imposing figure: wrinkled skin, stooped posture, his white hair combed neatly back. His frailty only seemed to heighten the sense of vulnerability around him. But, in truth, he was anything but defenseless. The thugs, sensing an opportunity, exchanged a quick glance. They had been on the prowl for hours, seeking someone they could overpower easily, someone they could rob without much resistance. When they spotted the elderly man, walking alone down the dimly lit street, it felt like luck had finally smiled on them. They didn't even think twice. One of them stepped forward, his hand already reaching for the old man's wallet, while the other hung back, watching the surroundings to ensure no one was nearby. They didn't need to worry: this neighborhood was deserted at this hour. The first thug grabbed the old man by the arm, yanking him to a stop. The old man didn't flinch, his eyes merely shifting up to meet the thug's gaze. There was something unnerving about the calmness in his expression, something that made the thug hesitate for a moment. "Give me your wallet, old man," the thug snarled, shaking the old man's arm harder. "Now." The old man didn't respond immediately. His fingers, frail and weathered, slowly curled into a fist, and for a moment, the thug thought he might have misjudged the situation. Maybe this old man wasn't as helpless as he seemed. Just as the thug was about to say something else, the second thug, who had been scanning the area, stiffened. His eyes locked onto something in the distance, his hand twitching slightly. The first thug noticed his partner's reaction but shrugged it off, his focus still on the old man. The sense of power was intoxicating. But then, in one swift motion, the old man turned, his hand shooting out to grip the thug's wrist. The thug's eyes widened in disbelief as the old man's strength, sharp and unexpected, twisted his arm behind his back. The pain hit immediately, causing him to grunt, a sound of surprise more than anything else. He'd never expected this. Not from someone who looked like him. "What the hell?" The thug growled, trying to break free, but the old man's grip was unyielding, like iron, despite his frailty. The second thug took a step forward, his hand reaching for the knife tucked into his belt. He was about to intervene when something in the distance caught his eye: a figure, emerging from the shadows. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as it moved closer, it became clear who it was. A man, tall, wearing dark military fatigues and a stern expression. He walked with purpose, every step calculated and precise. There was no mistaking the way he carried himself: the confidence, the discipline. This wasn't just some passerby. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Let him go." The voice that came from the figure was low, cold, and commanding. The thugs froze. The old man's grip on the first thug's arm tightened even more, and he didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. As if he had been waiting for this moment all along. The second thug's hand hovered over the knife, his eyes darting between the old man and the newcomer. He wasn't sure whether to make a move or run. His instinct was telling him that this wasn't a situation he wanted to escalate, but his greed, his desire to take what wasn't his, pushed him to act. "Who the hell are you?" The first thug spat, trying to break free from the old man's grasp. But the newcomer didn't respond right away. He simply stepped closer, his presence alone sending a chill down both thugs' spines. In the stillness of the night, the air felt heavy with tension. The second thug was the first to make a move, pulling the knife from his belt and brandishing it. The glint of steel caught the faint light of a nearby street lamp, and he lunged forward, aiming for the newcomer. But it was clear this man was no ordinary passerby. The moment the thug tried to strike, the figure ducked, spinning effortlessly on his heel. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the thug's wrist, twisted, and with a sickening crack, the knife fell to the ground. The thug let out a howl of pain, clutching his arm, but before he could even react further, he was sent crashing to the pavement with a single, calculated push. The whole exchange took mere seconds. The first thug, now panicked, backed away from the old man, his eyes wild with fear as he assessed the situation. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be easy. They were supposed to get away, fast, without a fight. But now, their target wasn't some helpless senior, it was someone who was clearly far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. "Leave him alone!" the first thug yelled, his voice trembling. The figure, unmoved by the thug's pleas, stepped closer to the old man, who finally released his hold on the attacker's arm, letting him stagger backward. The thugs exchanged a glance, their breaths quickening, and for the first time, they realized they were the ones who were outmatched. "What do we do now?" the second thug gasped, his arm still throbbing from the earlier pain. He looked around frantically, wondering if there was any chance of escape. The first thug was silent, his mind racing. He wanted to run, but the sight of the newcomer, this well-trained, disciplined figure, had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. This wasn't just anyone. It wasn't until the old man spoke that they truly understood the depth of their mistake. "They didn't know who I am," the old man said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, but with a coldness that sent a shiver down the thugs' spines. "You made a terrible mistake." The figure beside the old man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the two attackers. He was calm, steady, but there was a sense of finality in the air that made it clear he wasn't there to negotiate. His presence was enough to crush whatever hope the thugs might have had. The thugs' eyes darted back and forth between the old man and the newcomer. They were both silent now, and the weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. They had no idea what kind of family they had just crossed, nor did they understand the depth of the consequences they would face. As the seconds ticked by, the thugs knew they had only two choices: fight or flee. But deep down, they knew that neither option would end in their favor. And in the shadows, a story was unfolding. A story of a son protecting his father. A story that no one had expected. But there was more to this story than anyone could imagine, and as the old man turned to the figure at his side, a chilling realization began to form in the minds of the thugs. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that the son wasn't just any special forces officer. His skills, his training, had been forged through years of danger, deception, and battle. And as the old man stood by his side, a quiet sense of justice began to stir, ready to bring a reckoning to the two criminals who had chosen the wrong target. What would happen next? Would the thugs realize the magnitude of their mistake before it was too late, or would they dig themselves even deeper into a hole they couldn't escape from? The silence between the two thugs and the old man's son stretched on, thick and suffocating. The second thug's breathing was erratic, his hand still clutching his wounded arm, and his eyes flicked nervously between the two men in front of him. The first thug, now visibly shaking, backed away a step, his face pale. He knew they were outmatched. There was no escape from the situation they had gotten themselves into. But the second thug wasn't ready to give up just yet. Desperation was a dangerous thing, and he didn't want to go down without a fight. He knew the risks, he had seen firsthand what this man could do, but he had been in worse situations before. At least, that's what he told himself. He could still fight, still run, still find a way out. But deep down, he knew this was different. This wasn't just a street fight with some random person. The calmness of the old man and his son told a story of experience and danger, an experience they couldn't have possibly fathomed. "You don't have to do this," the first thug stammered, trying to find the words to negotiate. "We didn't know who you were." "We were just enough," the old man said sharply. His voice, though quiet, held an authority that cut through the thug's rambling. The thugs flinched at the sound of his tone, as if the very words carried the weight of something far greater than simple anger. You've made your choices. Now you'll deal with the consequences. The second thug's panic was now evident, his body trembling as he realized that their chances of getting out of this were slipping away. He was no longer thinking clearly, only acting out of instinct, driven by fear. He gripped his knife tighter, the blade slick with his own sweat and anticipation, but before he could make another move, the son took one step forward. The speed at which he moved was almost unnatural. The thug didn't even see him approach, but in the blink of an eye, the son's hand was at his throat. He gasped, his body going rigid as the man's grip tightened. I said enough, the son's voice was low, controlled. But there was a dangerous calm to it, one that made the thug's heart race faster. You've made a lot of mistakes tonight. You're lucky it's not worse for you. The first thug's face paled further, his entire body now frozen in place. He looked at the son's eyes, cold, calculating, and unwavering, and he knew, in that instant, that the fight was over. There would be no escape for them. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, the son released the thug's throat, sending him stumbling backward in a daze. The second thug collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, but there was no fight left in him. What do you want? The first thug finally managed to croak out, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse and broken from the tension. The old man stepped forward slowly, his face unreadable. He didn't need to say much more. His presence alone was enough to silence the thug's pleas. The son turned to his father, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, a silent understanding between them. They had both been through too much to let these two walk away unscathed. But there was no need for further violence. Not yet, anyway. The old man's voice was quiet but firm when he spoke. Call the police. They'll handle the rest. The thug's eyes widened, their panic giving way to disbelief. They hadn't expected this. They had expected retribution, swift and merciless. But they hadn't counted on being handed over to the authorities. They had underestimated the strength of this family, the depth of the old man's son's training. And so, as the son pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the police, the two criminals were left to contemplate their fate. They had thought they could take what they wanted. They had thought they were in control. But now, they were at the mercy of someone far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. As the sirens in the distance began to grow louder, the tension in the air started to dissipate. The old man stood calmly by his son's side, his gaze never leaving the thugs. They were scared now, their previous bravado gone. They had learned the hard way that when you mess with the wrong people, there are consequences. The police arrived within minutes, their cars screeching to a halt as officers piled out, ready to handle the situation. The thugs were taken into custody without further incident, their protests falling on deaf ears. It was over. But for the son and his father, this wasn't the end of their story. They walked away from the scene together, the father's slow, deliberate steps matching the pace of his son's determined strides. It was clear that they had both seen things that most people would never understand. As they reached the old man's home, the son finally spoke, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the entire ordeal. Are you okay? He asked, his voice softer now, the tension of the confrontation still hanging in the air. The old man nodded, his expression unreadable. I've seen worse, he said simply. But thank you. There was a pause, a moment of understanding between them. The son had known that his father was no ordinary man, but to witness it firsthand, to see the quiet strength and resilience that had been passed down through generations, was a different experience altogether. It was a reminder of the legacy they shared, a legacy that had shaped who they were and who they would always be. But even as the tension began to fade, the son couldn't help but wonder how many other times had his father quietly endured danger, kept secrets, and survived situations like the one they had just faced. And how many more were there yet to come? As they sat together, the night growing colder, the old man's eyes drifted to the window, his mind clearly elsewhere. He had lived a long life, a life filled with hardship, loss, and sacrifice. And while he may have been a victim in the eyes of the thugs that night, he was no helpless man. He had lived through worse, and he had raised a son who could stand beside him in moments like these. The son, though grateful for the peace that had returned to their lives for now, knew that the world was never as simple as it seemed. Danger was always lurking, always waiting to strike when you least expected it. But for now, for this night, they were safe. And as they sat in the quiet of the living room, the weight of the evening's events still hanging heavy, the son reflected on the lesson that had been reinforced for him. Strength wasn't just physical. It wasn't just about the fights you could win. It was about resilience. About standing tall when everything seemed to be falling apart. About knowing that, no matter what, you never give up. It was a lesson his father had taught him long ago. And one that, despite the trials and tribulations, he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The story wasn't over. But for now, at least, they had survived. And for both of them, that was enough. As the night stretched on and the house fell into a quiet stillness, the son couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one chapter in a much larger story. One that would continue to unfold, with new challenges and dangers lurking just around the corner. But whatever happened next, he knew one thing for sure: they would face it together.